for us, please?
Yep.
Thanks, mate. And we'll see how many men we can upset tonight.
Once we're live, even before the intro, this is actually...
Every description of God that I've heard holds God to be all-powerful, very typical, and all good. And I see earthquakes and tornadoes and disease, childhood leukemia, and I see all of this and I say, I do not see evidence of both of those being true simultaneously. If there is a God, the God is either not all-powerful or not all good.
I never get sick of hearing that. A man constantly trying to uncover truths both in science and belief. The now world-famous Neil deGrasse Tyson kicking off episode 19 of this live podcast of an atheist, a believer, and a pastor walking
and a really good-looking guy.
Yeah, we're still looking. People are waiting, and I'm sure he's arriving. I'm live right now on YouTube and Facebook. G'day, I'm your host, Peter Rowe. If this is your very first time tuning in, welcome. So look, we're a bunch of Aussies from very different backgrounds, different cultures, ages, ethnicities, and beliefs, the whole bit. We are a mixture of atheists and Christians here tonight, as we are every night. Now, I was a devout Christian, as it were, for over 25 years, but 12 years ago, I decided that there simply wasn't any evidence to support my ongoing beliefs. I discovered a couple of weeks ago that the driving force behind my decision to reach out, I believe, was because of a deep need for love and acceptance. When that kind of love and acceptance came into my life, the feeling was that God simply disappeared, which I kind of find a little strange and quite amazing, to be honest. We try on this podcast to discuss the deeper questions in the pursuit of understanding how this whole human being thing works, and we'd love you to be a part of it. You can do so on Facebook or YouTube right now, live on this Wednesday, the 1st. I know it's the 1st of May. Wow. 2024. Incredible. Welcome. Great to have you with us tonight. It's just gone 8 o'clock Australian Western Standard Time. So just ask your question or make a comment in the window and we will endeavor to engage you with it. Now, there's a touch of irony tonight with the subject matter in light of the fact that we are all men. And just quickly too, Suresh has called in late saying he's unable to join us tonight too. So that's unfortunate, but he's a very busy man. Tonight we're discussing the statement, one of the greatest lies of patriarchy is framing the father as the life giver. In spite of all the progress we've made bridging the gap between men and women, in too many areas, it's still like that of a chasm. I'm lucky in many ways. I'm married to a staunch feminist. Look, she's not the type who likes to beat her chest and attack men for the hell of it. She actually leads by example and finds ways to share the need with us all, and have so far to go before the word equality actually can ever be uttered. She has taught me much, and the ingrained attitude of men over women, the maleness of many of us permeates to the very core of what women have to experience every single day, sometimes in very subtle ways and some in the cruel, hateful world of domestic violence. But how do we stop it? Or is it so ingrained that we can't? Either way, we have to keep striving so women feel safe, loved, respected, free, intelligent, and equal. Helping me through this potential minefield are two now, learned gentlemen who I'm sure will share my desire to discuss the ongoing need to continue the narrative. Flying this somewhat dilapidated craft tonight in the absence of Rich, is Bible teacher and all-round nice guy, Luke Feeney. G'day, Luke. How are you?
G'day, gents. And anyone watching, it's good to be here. By the skin of my teeth.
Good on you, mate. As I mentioned, Suresh, not with us. Another man we have is known as the Farmer's Regret, Jason Jordan from beautiful downtown Albany in the great southern of Western Australia. G'day, Jace.
I'm just here for the light relief, Pete.
Yeah, good luck with that. Hope you're a patient man. We've got a lot of work to do tonight to try and make sense of this male-dominated world in which we live. Let me just repeat the title of tonight's podcast. One of the greatest lies of patriarchy is framing the father as the life giver. Men have always strived to be the dominant force. Evolution tells us, of course, that there is a vast difference between men and women. Men were hunters and gatherers, and women raised the children, by and large. Somewhere along the line, it may seem that men have taken that as being superior. And sadly, there are far too many men who haven't evolved much since coming out of the caves. The Bible, I don't think, certainly hasn't helped. The Christian God has always been perceived as being male. His first creation was a man, and God breathed life into him. And then the first woman was taken from the body of Adam according to the scriptures. Now, to me, this insinuates that rather than just making them exist the way he did everything else, he chose to make a point, perhaps, that the man is superior. Obviously, the early authors only had men in mind when they set about writing the text that would be later become, of course, the Bible. Worth noting, gentlemen, that in the entire writings contained in the Bible, there is not one single line written by a woman. That, to me, tells us a lot. How much male dominance is still in the world? I was going to ask Suresh, of course, because he comes from a very different cultural background than we do, and I would have thought it would have been a great look into the world in which he lives. So because he's not here, Luke, let's start with you, because I've made a couple of what could be considered sweeping statements there. What's your comment about the way the world has evolved into something, I guess, which is still very much connected to male dominance from days gone by?
Yeah, look, I think it's safe to say we've still got a long way to go. That's certainly not up for question. There is still elements of this thing that we've labelled patriarchy that has it rears its ugly head in many institutions, in many areas. For me, I guess, coming at it from a Bible perspective, I was looking forward to this once I found out this was going to be our topic, because this is one of the most misunderstood, I think, areas around the Bible's position and I guess what you could then construe as God's position around male and female. And the reason there's been a lot of confusion around that is because there's been some extremely poor interpretations that have come from some of these texts. And we're talking about texts that were written in an inherently patriarchal culture, far more so than today. These are ancient texts that's why there's none that were written by women. That is a reflection more on the culture that it was written in rather than on God's wishes. Because for me, when I read through the Bible, I see clearly there are some areas in there that are problematic, that you go, that's not what you would want to see. But there's also a lot of threads through there that are incredibly progressive, that are actually incredibly liberating, and that elevate the role of women, that would have been extremely radical for the time that it was written in, and that form a picture of a God who views men and women as absolutely and unmistakably equal in every aspect. Egalitarian is probably the label that we would put on that, and that's what I would label myself as well. And I think that's beautiful. And I'd love, obviously, tonight we'll get the chance, so I'll be able to look at some of those things, like the Adam and Eve story that you mentioned, obviously all the way through to the New Testament when we see Jesus. But I think you'd be surprised to find out, and that's where I'd probably push back a little bit, is that, yes, the Bible was written in a very, very much patriarchal culture, which is a reflection of the time and that culture. That wasn't exclusive just to I guess the Hebrew Bible, but what we see in it is not what we would expect to see come from that culture in a lot of areas. And that gives us a lot of hope to think, well, maybe these interpretations that have led to very, very toxic behaviors and toxic power dynamics between men and women from the church are the result of very, very poor interpretation, as rather than the intentions of God per se, which is a really important distinction to make for me. So I won't use the introduction to go into any of them, but suffice it to say that's my position, that the Bible's far more progressive than we actually realize it is when it comes to women.
Let me just pull you up on a couple of things then, Luke, based upon what you've said. Often the reason given of no input into the Bible is that women weren't educated enough to read or write, let alone to contribute. Now, I find it hard to believe that you're willing to accept that men and women in God's eyes are 100% equal when women were never given the chance. Why weren't they educated the way men were so that they could make things of themselves? They actually could have an input into the future understanding of human beings based upon the Christian belief, and a couple of scriptures too, which I think challenge what you said even more in Timothy. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet. How can that possibly be, in God's view, an equal acceptance of men and women? And also in Leviticus, and everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. I mean, from my perspective, my understanding of the Bible, I see it as being, it can't be patriarchal dominance and that and some sort of equal sitting between God and men and women. I don't understand how you can justify that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the very first point to clarify on that would be the fact that God didn't write the Bible. And this is something that probably comes as a shock to many people, certainly not to either of you, because I feel like I say it all the time. But God didn't write the Bible. It didn't fall out of the sky. Not everything in the Bible is exactly what God wants to say. If that was the case, God would be incredibly schizophrenic, because there's parts throughout the Bible that contradict each other. And
Sure, yep.
there's no point pretending that that isn't the case. So we know now. I believe the Bible is inspired in the sense that there is elements throughout the Bible, and there is a thread there that is a progressive understanding of who God is revealed in Jesus. But for me, that doesn't mean I have to read every single line literally. When we look at like the Leviticus passage that you say, for example, around the uncleanliness of a woman, that's referring to their purity culture, right? So that their understanding of cleanliness and uncleanliness when it comes to presenting yourself to the temple, to God. But it wasn't just women who obviously would, if they were on their period, they were deemed unclean. If a man had a wet dream, that's in there, he would be unclean. If a man and woman had sex, if they were married, for example, they would both be unclean until 24 hours had passed or whatever. So there's a whole lot there that applies to both men and women. And there's far more problematic verses in there. The Timothy one that you mentioned in the New Testament is a cracker, because that's really the one that most complementarians hang their hat on. The I guess the preachers or the leaders that really push this sense of male hierarchy, male leadership, headship over a woman. That's usually their cornerstone verse. But there again, this is a verse that needs to be understood actually correctly. The word that it uses for authority doesn't actually mean what we actually think it means. It's a very, very different understanding of that. There's all sorts throughout that. That particular verse will be taken as literal, and yet the same hermeneutics won't be applied to the bits before it or the bits after it. There is the historical context of that verse as well, around the Roman. There was a female goddess that was actually called Diana or Artemis, who was worshipped in Rome at the time. And she basically, there would be temple prostitution, cultic prostitution, that would be to worship this female god, this goddess. and it was it was very damaging. Women would be taken from their families and forced to effectively be a prostitute in this, to worship in this temple. So, but it was a Roman designated deity. So to come straight out and actually attack what was an authorized Roman god would be incredibly dangerous. So there's a lot of subversive nature through the New Testament where they are attacking harmful practices throughout Rome or from the Roman Empire, but they can't do it in a way that's so overt. So that's one of the understandings of that passage where it's talking about a woman teaching and things like that. I won't go into more details, I don't want it to become a Bible study. But again, that's a historical context around that is important to understand. There is a fact that there are other parts of Paul's preaching and Paul's writings that contradict that, where he talks about there's, no Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, that there is no difference. So why do we elevate that particular line over other lines that seem to contradict that? It's because it serves a greater purpose for the one who's doing the interpreting. If you're a male and you're benefiting very much from being in a complementarian relationship where you're the head of the home and you're in charge and women can't preach and women can't do this, and you want to maintain that control, then it makes sense to want to perpetuate this interpretation. But once you start to dig into that, it's not the case. And failing all of that, even if you were to dig into it and you were to find that that's actually what Paul meant, right? It says Timothy, but that's Paul writing to Timothy. It's not Timothy who's writing the letter. Then you can look at it and say, well, Paul was a product of his time. This isn't Jesus writing. This is not, there's things he's going to get right. There are things he's going to get wrong. Maybe that was one of the things he's going to get wrong. I tend to lean on the side that Paul wasn't like that actually we're not understanding what he's saying correctly. It's a very convenient one to take at face value. But even if I found that was wrong, I'd be quite comfortable dismissing that and not applying that to God or applying that to Jesus, because the life of Jesus is very, very different compared to that sentiment that comes from that. So there are scriptures, but there's also a whole lot of scriptures as well that support the equality of men and women, and that actually elevate women and paint women in a far greater light than men in a lot of cases, going all the way back to Genesis.
What I'm confused about is you did say that God sees men and women as being equal, and yet the Bible doesn't necessarily always reflect that, does it? But we might go back to that, because I want to talk about she is to remain quiet, that part of Timothy. We might discuss that, but I just want to welcome Frank Tovey. So he can't stay very long, but good luck with the stream, guys. Thanks, Frank. If you've got any comments to make and like to partake in what it is we're talking about. Now, time to check out our man about town, the only person who's actually nicely dressed among the three of us, a T-shirt as well that Luke and I can conjure up. So, Jace, you've been around a little while. You're a married man. You've got kids. How have you dealt with passing on to your children the respect, the love, the need, the integrity associated with women by and large?
Well, Rowie, let's put it like this. In my household, I'm the boss. And I'm the boss, and I know I'm the boss because Trisha's told me I can be.
That's right. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
You wear the pants, she just tells you which ones.
Well, I wear the pants that she picks for me and tells me which pants I'm going to wear that morning. So, we have one of those. Look, the bottom line is, for me, and this may be a slightly controversial take, I'm not entirely sure. I know when I've tried to explain it to people previously, they've always sort of asked a few questions, but I've always felt in the relationship that I have with my wife is that we are equals, but in complementary ways. So we're not the same, but we are equal. And we have roles to play within our relationship that we have chosen. And it's not on anyone else to actually make value judgments on what the roles are that we have within our relationship. They're the roles that we're comfortable with. They're the roles that we've taken on, and they're the roles that we have successfully executed now for the last 26, 27 years. So for us, it's been a formula for success. And certainly it's one of the ways that we've been able to demonstrate to our children about how you play your role in society. And, you know, there are people that want to break norms. There are people that want to do things differently, and that's cool. That's okay. Do it. Be you. You do you. But for us, and for the values I've tried to instill in my children, it's always been about the respect that Trish and I have for each other, and the acknowledgement that we have, to an extent, some gender-based roles as well. And again, I think a lot of people today would go, well, hang on, why is Trish in the kitchen and why are you outside mowing the lawn? That's the way we've chosen to do it. And there are some relationships where it might be the other way around. There are some relationships where both parties might do both things. But for us, what we're comfortable with and what we have decided to do is that thing that particular way. But there's a couple of other things I do want to say as well, just based on some of the stuff that Luke was saying and your introduction. I blame women very much for the situation we're in, Pete, because the original sin was all because that woman ate that damn apple. She should have known better, Pete. I'm so angry at women in general as a result of that all those years ago. Further than that, in the Middle East, all those years ago, everybody wore a dress. They were all wearing dresses. There's none of the judgments that people have today about people cross-dressing. They wore these gowns. As far as I'm concerned, you can only call that a dress. Am I wrong, guys? Am I wrong? Everybody's wearing dresses. That's cool. Now, the final point I want to make, actually the second final point, the penultimate point that I want to make. I reckon that part of the whole reason that we've got this patriarchal system is that women for a very long time have been seen as a chattel, as something that you can own, as something that is yours to instruct and make do what you want. In other words, your own slave. And that is completely and utterly reprehensible behavior. That attitude in itself is ridiculous. And to me, that is part of where the core reasoning behind what we see in a lot of domestic violence, because blokes feel that they have the right to execute their preferences onto that particular person because she's a woman. And that is unacceptable. It is objectionable. And I will talk more about this as we progress through the program. But I want to make a point very, very early on that it's on us as reasonable thinking, rational men to make sure that our peers, our friends, our family members never take the position that they are somehow superior to the women folk around them, and never, ever participate in domestic violence. And I can tell you right now, if I knew any of my friends or family were doing that kind of thing, there would literally be hell to pay. That is not acceptable behavior. And the last point I want to make, just quickly, because I don't want to dominate the conversation, just a little bit. The big question for me is around genderizing God. Now, I know we've talked previously, Luke, about me believing that I am essentially a Christian without supernatural beliefs. And so when I look at the value structures that Christians, claim to have, and I think I possess as many of those as it's possible to have, I very often think about the nature of what the universe is without necessarily calling it God. And then I think about how so many people refer to Mother Nature and that they see that as being a form of God, and yet that's gendered female. So to me, I look at this idea of a not necessarily a supernatural entity, but certainly an overarching intelligence or consciousness. And I don't think that it's appropriate to actually place a gender on that. And whether it be God perceived as a male or whether it be Mother Nature perceived as a female, I think the very act of genderizing straight away causes a level of discrimination and a way of separating the genders and the sexes that we currently have. And I think the respect that has to be there is for us to acknowledge that we're all equal in a very different kind of way.
Yep.
Amen.
Yep. Couldn't
Preach.
agree. Couldn't agree more. And look, the whole God thing. Yeah, it's hard to sort of change the language and change the vision, which is kind of one of the bizarre things I found through my time with Christianity, is that so much of it is just what we've made up. In fact, pretty much all of it is what people have made up in a way to try and wrap their heads around. If there was a God, it'd have to be a big wise man with a beard and grey hair. Surely that's who we want. We
No, that's
want a
Gandalf.
father figure. Yeah, that's right. We want a father figure. We want somebody who we can connect with and relate to, and that's the father figure, and that's where the whole image, I think, of God came from. And I want to touch on what you said about the attitude toward your wife. And I think regardless of what each person does in their marriage, the fact that you should never want to be in any way superior or rule over or arch over your wife. I remember a time back in my Christian days where I didn't necessarily believe it, but it kind of made me feel good to think that, if given the last word, it's going to be me, because I'm the head of the house. I only ever did it once or twice. And the two
Yeah,
men who
I
have
once
never met
told my
my
wife I
wife,
was the boss. Once. I once told my wife.
and when I regained consciousness in Ward 3 of Royal Perth Hospital,
That's right.
You reconsidered it.
And it's fair to say that I grew up in a house where it was fairly standard back in the day that Dad was a bit of a chauvinist and not in a bossy, aggressive kind of way, but it was just the way things were back then, and that's what I grew up thinking was the right way. That was what's so weird about this. God's a man, I'm a man, Dad's a man, beautiful. And it wasn't until we got married where I don't know whether I inadvertently or kind of assumed this kind of semi-chauvinistic attitude. And anyone that knows my wife, it went down like a lead balloon. I was very quickly reminded of our equality and how that was the only acceptable status quo. That's it. We are equal. And if you think we're not, then we've got major problems.
Let me ask you a question. And it's purely a taste test.
Right.
When you go out with your partner, who drives?
It depends. We've both got cars. So when we go out in her car, she drives. When I go in my car, I drive. Or I will switch over and drive her car. She will never, ever drive out my car when we go out together.
Because she's not allowed to, or because she doesn't want to?
No, because she hates it. It's a lowered, powerful, fast, noisy, loud race car.
A chauvinistic car. Okay, I get
Correct. It. Very much a male dominated car.
Luke,
but no,
who drives?
Sorry?
It's fairly even, but to be honest, I drive most of the time when we go out. But yeah, there's often times when Tash will.
I mean, you probably know exactly where I'm heading with this, but in virtually every single Christian relationship that I know of, and I've got lots of friends who practice their religion, in those Christian relationships, it's always the bloke that drives. And I've never really understood it. I mean, in my relationship, 99% of the time, Trish drives because I'm a lazy sod and I'd rather have a little sleep.
I mean, look, it's not a thing that people sit down and discuss and decide what we're going to do. It's part of that follow on from the way we were brought up and the way our parents were brought up, and it just goes back and back and back and back. And the origins are in a male dominated world from the cave days right the way through, and we still are hanging on to much of it. So much so that when a couple get married or go, the guy will generally drive the car. Now, there's also another part truth, I believe, with that, is that men seem to, and this was probably going to piss off a lot of people, I hope it doesn't, a lot of men prefer to drive. and women don't. Now, for whatever reason, you can apply that to so many different aspects of marriage and about life. I love working outside because that's what I do. I'm good at it. Lou loves getting in the kitchen and cooking. Not You'd never suggest in a billion years she's doing it because she's a woman. She's doing it because she's really good at it, and she
She's doing
loves
it
it.
because you like Lou to make the sandwiches. That's what it's all about, Pete.
She loves it. That's her domain. She's very good at it. She loves it. Her mum was a great cook. It's if you've ever watched MasterChef, Lou is the kind of person, and we watch it every night. She's the kind of person who just loves that, and that's a part of who she is. I would never, ever dare suggest, nor would I want to, that she's in the kitchen because she's the woman and I'm out the front yard, like you said before, because I'm the man. That is not the case. It is very much utilizing our gifts and our abilities in the most
And your
humble,
preferences.
loving, caring way that you can. I mean, don't always get it right, but
Yeah.
that's by and large how we choose to operate within the dynamic of a marriage. So I learned very quickly early on the piece that no, chauvinism is not something that you're going to get away with. So by all means, go ahead, give it a bash. Let's see where this goes. Sorry, that's an inappropriate word to use in this conversation, considering we are talking about
Yes.
which we will go to in a minute, because there's a massive move in Australia at the moment wanting the government to do something about the levels of domestic violence. So we'll get to that as a part of the conversation. But there's a few comments coming through. Fenton, g'day, Fenton. Great to have you back, mate. I feel the greater issue is the false belief in authority structures being part of the laws of nature. Yeah, it's obvious anthropic bias.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. I think we're all nodding with that one, Fenton. And Frank,
You don't get to be the boss just because you're bigger. You know what I mean?
yeah,
We're intelligent animals now. We're intelligent creatures, and we should understand what equality means.
yeah, but like everything else in the world, people want the world to be beautiful and perfect, and we're all loving. That is never going to happen because we are an evolving species, and we are all different, and we're not all robots. And you get nice people, and you get horrible people, and the horrible people will gravitate toward accepting violence and aggression toward their wives because they think they're superior. The wife is inferior. Most of those cowards would never have the balls to take it up to a man, a decent, big, strong man. They attack women. They are cowards. They are the absolute vermin of this world in which we live.
This is where it gets particularly dangerous with the weaponizing of Scripture. Not just the Bible, but all forms of Scripture where there are ancient texts that are given a weight beyond themselves in all sorts of different religions. But obviously, I'll speak on behalf of the Christian version with the Bible. And you see these people. You don't need to be a big man when God says it. Yeah, when you have weaponized Scripture to say, well, this isn't even my idea. I'm just doing what God said. God says that I'm the head of the house. God says that it's my word is the last word. God says you ought to be quiet. God, that's rubbish. It is absolute a violation. It's shocking. But that then is it's the way in for people who want that power structure, who want that power dynamic in their relationships, and want to be able to excuse it as simply being obedient to God, when really it's simply just a convenient way for them to feel in control.
And the problem is it's not a simple case for a woman being able to say, I'm unhappy in this relationship. I'm unhappy that there's domestic violence. I'm just going to walk away from it. That is such a simplistic view of how you can solve the problem, because very often these women are stuck in these relationships and there doesn't appear to be any way out. And, I know I'm probably hitting on this just a little bit soon, but I saw a promo for the latest episode of Q&A, and there was a criminologist talking about domestic violence. And he was having a go at the politicians who are up on stage saying, You guys have got to stop talking about how the government can help here. You've got to stop talking about how we need a royal commission into domestic violence, and you've got to start funding the frontline programs where we can actually, number one, provide assistance to the women who are suffering under domestic violence, but number two, start these education programs, which I know it always sounds like a really twee solution to say education is where it's at, but unfortunately, I really do think that's what's very important, is we need to start educating people who don't know any better, or sometimes do know better, to say this is unacceptable. But Pete, we have to take it a step further than that. It's not on the police. It's not on the government. It's not on anyone but us. Not just fellow men, but the friends of people, the family of people. If we know of anyone that is committing domestic violence, it's on us, not to report it, but to actually recognize it and talk to them about it. And yes, that could be very dangerous, because if you're dealing with someone who is prone to violence or can be irrational or is someone that is abusing drugs, we're putting ourselves in a dangerous situation. But that woman can be in an even more dangerous situation, and it's on us without exception.
It's all about power with men. It's purely power. The same thing that drives rape, and it's power, and that's what they want. And if a woman tries to get away and the man tries to disconnect that power, then they're not going to let it happen. And the results are what we're seeing at the moment, which I said we will get to that. But I just want to go back to Frank's comments. It's like yin and yang. One can't live without the other. Modern feminism tries to make us exactly the same. We are not. I disagree with that entirely, Frank. I don't think modern feminism tries to make us exactly the same at all. Some feminists, there are levels of everything, isn't there? You can't generalize and sort of package all feminists in the same box, because that's not fair. It's not true. It's not accurate. Maybe in your experience, the modern feminists you've come across, maybe are they trying to do that? And certainly the early feminist movement, which Germaine Greer was, of course, one of the most famous with the book, The Female Eunuch. I mean, she copped so much flack for having the audacity to try and suggest that men and women were equal on all levels. That's another story. But he's saying we are not. It's culture. We all have our roles to play, and that's a good thing. It's true. Did I misinterpret what he's saying there? I can't live without a modern feminism tries to make us use. Yeah, no, I think that's. I don't think that's true. But okay, this is an open podcast to.
I've definitely come across feminists that do take that position, and it's infuriating, because we're not all of that same mindset. As we talked about before, there are gender-based roles that we often want to take on, and I'll give you an example. And I was talking about this earlier today with some of my kids. As an example, and I know I'm going to cop something for this. In the main, firefighters tend to be male, because it is the sort of role which requires a bit of physical strength, a bit of adrenaline, a bit of aggression to actually get the job done. Now, I'm not saying it's a male role. I'm saying in the main, males tend to be attracted to that kind of position. That doesn't mean we should stop females from wanting to be firefighters. By all means, if that's your chosen career, you need to have the physical capabilities of performing that role and keeping your colleagues safe. Similarly, it tends to be that women gravitate towards roles like nursing. That doesn't mean that men shouldn't be nurses. If a man wants to be a nurse, by all means, we're equal. We can do that. But you look at the way that culture has surrounded us over the last however many years, and we tend to see certain people moving into certain types of roles based on their gender. That's not to say it's right or wrong. I don't think we should be making value judgments on that. But it happens. And I just don't think we should be critical about it. We should let people do the roles they want to do, and acknowledge that sometimes, based on our culture, someone might be better at performing a particular kind of role. Now, you can ask the question, when we start looking at, for example, the composition of a board of directors, and how we're now starting to see certain ratio requirements amongst how many women you have to have on a board and how many men you have to have on a board. My big question to you guys is, should we have those kind of ratios? Are we saying that we should elevate less capable people into board positions, or are we simply saying we need to normalize the idea that we should have a balance of genders in everything that we do?
Oh, look, I think it's
Yeah.
a laid out there as far as I'm concerned. I think the best people for the job, and I've noticed an influx of this over the last 10, 15 years where people are being not forced into, but they're being pushed in who aren't necessarily the best people for the job. It's happened for men and women. But you've got to equal up the ledger. There needs to be an equal distribution of male and females, regardless of the job. I personally think that is ridiculous. It's impractical. It's not based upon best outcomes.
It's insulting.
Eh?
It's insulting. I
Well,
think to a lot of women to actually say, oh, we're going to put more women on the board, even if you're not particularly qualified, because we want to have a balance.
Yeah.
I think it's inappropriate on many, many, many levels.
Yeah, I would agree. The only thing I would add to that is clearly that's not where you would want it to be, nor would men or women want it to be like that, right? Everyone wants to feel that they are elevated to a position on their own merit. That's without question. What I understand, though, and whilst I disagree with that, putting someone into a position because of a gender or because of race simply to make up a ratio, I would say that the reason this practice has sort of come about is because for the last 100 years, the best person for the job has typically been a white male, right? And so every single person who gets there on their own merit has usually looked like a white male. So I understand the kickback to that, and to say, well, how do we change this? How do we normalize this? How do we get it so that women serving as a CEO or as on a board, or and people of color serving in these high level positions, how do we make that so that it sounds absurd to even think about that, but for that to become the norm when it should have always been that way.
You're absolutely right.
And that's I think the reaction there. Is it a perfect solution? Absolutely not. Is it a permanent long-term solution? It definitely shouldn't be. Is it the best solution now? I don't know, but it's something. And at least I understand the reasoning for it.
Oh,
whether it works or not. It
was
can certainly be taken the wrong. It can be taken too far. And often the worst thing is it can be turned into something that ticks a box, but actually doesn't move the needle forward in race relations or in gender equality in any actually substantive way. They just say, cool, we've met the criteria for our makeup of leadership, but they actually don't have any power, and it's the same old boys club as usual.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
what we don't want. You know what I mean?
10 years ago, I was the CEO of a relatively large IT company here in Western Australia. Now, I went out of my way to try and recruit more females because it's a heavily male-dominated industry. Now, regardless of what I tried to do, I simply couldn't attract more women into the roles because they simply weren't out there. I would advertise, I would always try and put the resumes at the top of the pile, try to interview the women first, make sure that, just to try and increase the numbers. But I never did it on the basis of putting an incapable person into a role. But the problem was I wasn't getting the applications in the first place. And that makes it really, really difficult to try and balance the ledger when they're simply not there. And that's a big reason why I encourage as much as possible women to enter those STEM kind of educational things where we're talking science and tech and engineering and mathematics, which are traditionally not areas that women tend to go into. That's where we need to encourage it. So at those earlier levels in the educational side of things, so that they can come out qualified, and then they will be accepted on their own merits into those roles. But you're absolutely right about saying there is a boys' club, a purple circle, whatever you want to call it, that is preventing women, not so much in the last 10 years, but certainly prior to that. But you know what? That kind of discrimination isn't just on women. It's gone so far now that middle-aged white guys like me are now discriminated against. There are certain roles and certain positions that I've got no chance of getting. And I'll give you a couple of examples without naming the organizations. I was working for a very large broadcasting organization, and there was a role that had come up that I wanted to apply for. And I was told in no uncertain terms, don't even bother applying because it's going to be a woman that's going to get that role. And I was just so taken aback by that very idea. I was also a member of a particular political party for quite some time. And I was, hand on heart, a signed up member who truly believed in everything that party was all about. And there was a role coming up for a Senate position that was never going to make Senate, but it was, on the ticket at a high level. And once again, whilst I had been sort of walked along as being the potential person to be in that role, it ended up being a transgender young person who was parachuted into that position purely on the basis of the organization wanting to look like it was walking the walk of the talking the talk that it was doing. And I'm starting to get a little frustrated with the fact that we are getting discriminated against on the basis of characteristics that we can't control, rather than simply being accepted for who we are and the skills that we have.
And I bet if you asked that transgender person who was elevated into that role, if that was a win for them, and on the surface you go, oh yeah, there's increased visibility or whatnot, but then you start to scratch the surface and they go, I would imagine they would think, when you're being used as a puppet simply because of your sexuality, that's a form of exploitation.
Yes,
masquerading as progressive, as a progression towards equality, and it's almost an insult to the actual.
The reason that they, the organization did it is not because they ever expected that person to ever make it into the political role of being a senator. So for them, it was all about the visibility. Whereas if they had genuinely believed that the person was going to make senator, then I expect that they would have put me in there simply because, I've got 30 years of business experience and, all these things that you would require in that kind of person. But you're right. It was all about the optics. They want to be seen to be doing the right thing, even if they're not necessarily doing the right thing.
Yeah. Which is not moving the conversation forward.
Let me jump in here, guys, and remind everyone watching on Facebook or YouTube tonight that we would love to get some feedback from you. It's a very interesting subject matter that we're discussing tonight, but we want you to be a part of it. And if you are on Facebook or YouTube, of course, you'll see a little window there, like these people like Frank and Greg and who's the other one? Fenton are making use of and putting in some comments and questions, because we love to be, love you to be a part of what we're doing. Greg said it's an interesting concept that a man can dominate a woman. Not in my lifetime. Absolutely. Look, it's extraordinary. These people are out there. I don't know anyone. I've never come across anyone in my life that I know who is a perpetrator of domestic violence. And it's not a coincidence that they make sure people don't know. Often you'll see people, I think, in your suburbs that never come outside. It's a young man, young woman, maybe a kid or two, and you look at them and think they never come outside. They never make sure they make any eye contact with you, never wave when they're driving past or coming out front. And there just seems to be this incredible strive for anonymity, and you think, what's going on in that house? What is going on in that place? And I'm not making judgment of people I don't know, but just it makes you think about what is happening in people's lives. And you rarely get to see it because they don't want anyone to know, because they know they are perceived to be some of the most vile people in our society that we do not want.
But Roy, an interesting thing, when I was growing up, we had neighbors across the road from us who there was always a lot of shouting going on, always. And you could hear things being thrown and so on. And you would hear screaming. But here's the bit, and I'm not suggesting that this is indicative of all domestic violence and all relationships, but this is my only experience of it, direct experience, was that whilst he was the perpetrator and what sounded like normally the initiator of what was going on, she was just as loud, just as violent, threw just as many swear words, and it felt to me was just as aggressive. Now, what do you do in that situation? Like, as a young guy, I mean, I'm 15 or 16 at the time, hearing that going on, and always under the belief, because I was brought up to believe that, you know, a bloke should never hit a woman. What happens in those perhaps rare occasions where the woman may actually be an instigator of the domestic violence, or if not the instigator, at least, you know, there is not that there's ever a justification for violence ever, but what if she goes first? What happens? What do you do? How do you deal with that situation?
It has to be treated exactly the same. I would have thought. You know, if we're going to talk about feminism and equal rights, and you know, we all stand on the same level, then if a woman was bashing, in fact, that's actually, I just remembered, that's actually happened where we live now. We got woken up 3 o'clock in the morning with the police, and went to the front door and opened the door, and this woman police officer looking at me, and she said, "Are you the owner of the house?" And I went, "Yeah, what's the hell's going on?" And she looked at me because she thought I had done something. And I said, "What can I help you?" She said, "We've had reports of domestic violence." And I went, "Oh, really? Well, we're both in bed asleep." And she looked at me going, "Yeah, righto, mate, sure." She was just looking straight through me. And I went, "Serious?" I said, "What's this about?" She said, "Couldn't you see your wife? Because she's apparently she's been bashing you." And I went, "What are you talking about?" I said, "That's just," and I called Louise out and I said, here we are. We're standing in front of you. Does it look like we've been bashing you?" As it turns out, it was the house down the back behind us, which had a similar number. And it was the wife who was beating up the husband. So she got actually taken away. So she was treated exactly the same. And rightfully so. I think you should. I mean, domestic violence is domestic violence, and no matter who the perpetrator is. But I also have a story similar to yours. When I grew up in I would have been 11, 12. And I remember the house out the back, over the fence, there was guy screaming like a maniac, and things being thrown and smashed and stuff. And I said to my dad, I said, "Dad, listen to that. Someone's in trouble. We need to help." And he turned to me and he said, "Son, don't get involved," and walked away. And that's what I was left with. And I went, wow, okay, that was not the right thing to be told. But anyway, that was his decision. And it's kind of struck me all through my life, going, how can you just turn your back on somebody who's in trouble? But anyway, back to the comments. Frank just clarifying that what he was referring to in his other comments, and saying need a technician programmer ? I'm not.
I don't
sure.
run an IT company any longer. I sold it.
No. And you're probably not where we are in Australia. And Frank said, well said. Fenton, unfortunately, victims of DV situations have to form some types of defense to maintain identity. Yeah. And then that defense can be used against them to justify more. Look at horrible circling. I tell you, one of the other, talking about professions and the inordinate amount of women that aren't involved. Motor racing. Now, I'm a huge motor racing fan. It is an incredible rarity to ever see a woman on any level involved in motor racing. There's been a couple of Simone, I can't think of her last name, with the V8 supercars who tried and went away and then came back to it again to try and get involved.
Yeah, now, she's doing OnlyFans these days, Pete. What's going on there?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think she's back to motor racing after that. But interestingly, so this is a two-pronged situation, I think. One is it's rare on any level, motorcycle racing, V8 supercars. Women are very rarely involved. And a part of that, I also would imagine that it would be an incredibly difficult purple circle to infiltrate, to be going in something as male-dominated and not being able to actually fulfill your ability. Do I think women can drive cars? Just, of course, absolutely they can, and better. And it's not a given that you got a penis, therefore you're a better racing car driver than someone who doesn't. That's absurd, and that's rubbish. But it is extraordinary that in 2024 it is a rarity to find a woman involved in motorsport. It's just so male dominated. Now, I want to just touch on something before we get on to the thing that's happening in Australia with domestic violence. This could offend a few people in this country, not overseas, because it doesn't apply. And we do have people like Fenton, who, of course, are from California. AFLW. Now, this is a classic example to me.
Boring.
Forcing because people wanted to see women play football. So they way ahead of time, before women were ever able to be competitive and be able to produce and play football anywhere near the quality of men's AFL football, they started AFLW and no one was watching it. Why? Well, because they weren't good enough. It was the same as watching 13-year-old kids play, without being insulting, because there's lots of great AFLW players. I get that. They are improving, but when it first started, they were doing it, I think, just to be doing the right thing by women. And I don't think it achieved anything. All it copped is so much flack from men. I've watched a lot of AFLW because I want to be fair and I want to enjoy it. But I'm sorry, it's a real struggle town. It really is, and I think that they're in danger of spoiling what they were trying to do by forcing it in too early.
I am an outsider when it comes to religion, when it comes to sport, right? I don't like sport. I have no interest in it whatsoever. So I am a true outsider when it comes to asking this question.
Mm-hmm.
If a woman comes along who is better than the worst player in the current AFL, why can she not be an AFL player? Why the hell do we have to have an AFLW? You can't tell me that the best of the female players is worse than the worst of the male players. So if they're more capable, if they're a physically capable, skilled ball player, why on earth do we have a rule that says you can't play in the AFL?
Mate, if you watch women's cricket, it is exactly the same to me as watching men's cricket. They are unbelievable. You never see women cricket.
But why is there women's cricket in that case?
I have no idea. No idea. Luke, you got
an
idea?
A great example right now. Have you guys been following this stuff happening over in America with the Caitlin Clark, the basketball player? She's just been, I think she was just #1 draft pick for the WNBA, right? Again, women's NBA.
Yep.
Her ability, so she has taken the world by storm. She's now being put in the same conversation as potentially being the greatest basketball player ever. Not female basketball player ever.
Yeah.
Basketball. She could be a generational talent, absolute legend. Like her stats, everything is just, it's so astronomically beyond anyone else that she's playing with that it's.
So why can't she be in the NBA?
Exactly.
Women can play in the Masters golf tournaments. Why can't she play in the NBA?
Particularly when NBA is not a hugely physical sport, right? Yeah, AFL. The argument could be you're tackling and you're doing all sorts of stuff. So there is.
But that's up to her.
Agreed. Yeah, I see that argument. But what I'm saying is NBA, that's not really the case. Certainly not the case with golf or with cricket or anything like that. So it's a legitimate argument. And
I get it when it comes to things like boxing. I don't want to see a bloke in the, even though I think in many instances, I think of Ronda Rousey, I think her name is, this is a female boxer who would beat the shit out of most blokes.
Absolutely.
But I just don't want to see a bloke beating a woman up in a boxing ring. But that said, it riles me. I get so angry when, as an outsider, I look at sports and I go, there is no reason, no rational justification as to why a talented, skilled, physically capable woman who by her own choice wants to play in the AFL can't. Why she can't be on an international soccer team, or why she can't be in the NBA. Why we are discriminating on the basis of gender instead of on the basis of capability. That's wrong, and that should stop today. Someone's going to sue, and I hope they win, and I hope we start women start seeing women playing on an equal level with the men, because they're going to kick our asses in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm all for that. All for
I
that.
mean, even in the the V8 racing cars, okay, they can drive just as well as a man can. And
Absolutely.
I don't get it. It just frustrates me. I look at the sport and I think, even, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here. I actually don't understand why they have an Aboriginal round in the AFL, because I just want everybody to be the same and be equal and just play the game the same way and be accepted for who they are and the talents that they've got. I mean, look, I get it. I know, again, it's about recognition and acknowledgement and respect and all of these sorts of things. I totally understand that. But fating one group over another, to me, even from a positive discrimination point of view or an affirmative action point of view, I think has repercussions that we're not acknowledging. And I think as soon as you start putting one group ahead of the other, you start building resentment. And then we're going back to the origins of discrimination and bigotry, because people start hating on each other. We just got to work on the level of equality.
And it's hard. I hesitate to comment because I like to comment when I have a solution, when I can say this doesn't work, but this would, and I don't have a solution. And I recognize with things like the Indigenous round that it is for to open up the conversation or to bring awareness. But again, similar to what we spoke about earlier, the danger that then comes is people saying, cool, we've focused on it in this weekend. We don't have to think about it again any other weekend.
Exactly.
And that defeats the whole purpose. This is not something that we should tick a box one weekend and go, okay, great. We've now acknowledged our Indigenous ancestry and history. And it's like, no, this should be something that permeates our lives in everything we do always, rather than just something that we chuck a different Guernsey on and say, great, we've done that. It's the same with Welcome to Country for everything. I love Welcome to Country. I think it's a great thing. But when you do it just to tick a box, it defeats the purpose of what it's designed to do. And so, again, we need to be careful that the solutions that we're bringing in order to bridge race relations and gaps that are there between either men and women or between different cultures don't simply just become band-aids to prevent the conversation actually moving forward, and actually they become something that does move the conversation forward.
And I hear what you're saying, guys.
It is a tricky one as far as the Indigenous round. Look, there's pros and cons for everything, isn't there? The recognition is important. There's no question about that. And I also hear what you're saying, Luke, that ticking a box. I'm a bit iffy about this, because I want to get to the point where we are just all footballers.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the origins of this country and our Indigenous brothers and sisters, it's completely different. It's a whole new argument. It's not something that you can go, well, they did this here and they did that there. I mean, it has happened obviously in New Zealand. I mean, I think the Maori people in New Zealand are treated a hell of a lot better, more respectful than we've ever done to our Aboriginal people in this country. But that's another whole argument. But it is tricky.
Look, I'm a white, middle-aged white guy, so I really shouldn't be participating in the conversation about whether or not we should be doing that. We should be asking them if they think it's an appropriate thing. Do they want that? Is that kind of recognition something that they really desire? Or is it, as I feel, patronizing, insulting, and ultimately disrespectful? Because we're saying, you're still different to us.
They wouldn't be a part of it. I think, considering the smothering that Australian people have done to Aboriginal people since the beginning, I think anything that we can do to help them, because it's to recognise who they are and what they are. It may be a little bit of tokenism. I get that, but if they didn't want to be a part of it, then they would make sure, I think, that they'd say, we don't want to do this anymore. Just don't highlight the fact. But I think any kind of recognition, paying homage to the great race, I think is something worthwhile. Just going to have a look at a few more comments, guys, before we move on. Fenton, unfortunately, victims in DV. I've already read the situations have to form some type of defense to maintain identity. Then that defense can be used against them to justify more abuse. I'm not sure if I've already read that. Another comment from Fenton. I do think the alpha male relationship in the house was greatly made stronger with Paul's writings. Okay, move on. Often biology makes choices from us, of us, from Greg, and I refuse to watch any AFLW. I want to ask you a big, and actually, let's just talk about some stats before we move on, as we head toward 9:30, which is roughly when we kind of start wrapping it up. And for those people who aren't in Australia, won't know about this, but it's really important to understand what's happening globally. In Australia at the moment, there are protests by tens of thousands of people calling for the government to do something about the sickening amount of women being murdered. Extraordinary explosion. 4 months into 2024, 33 women. Now, this is talking about a country of a population of, what are we up to now? We still around 25, 26 million, are we? Or
give or take.
Thereabouts. 33 women in Australia have been murdered, largely by someone, generally a man, that they knew. The data comes from Australia's Femicide Watch, a site run by journalists and researcher Sherelle Moody. The Legacy Press equates those figures to roughly one woman every 4 days in Australia is being murdered. Now, I agree totally, Jace, what you were saying about it's not the responsibility of the police. It is the responsibility of the government to institute, to put in laws that protect women. VRO is not worth the paper it's written on. They never have. It's not a deterrent. If you're a wife beater or a violent, power-grabbing maniac, you're not going to give a shit about a piece of paper that says, "Oh, don't go there," because they do. They do all the time.
Let's take it a step further. Whilst murder is the very worst outcome, right? That is, it's appalling. A number that's just as horrifying is that in Australia today, by the age of 15, 1 in 4 girls will have been sexually assaulted.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, I'm sorry, Pete, I'm going to swear. That is fucking unacceptable.
Right.
Utterly.
Yeah. I know people. I know so many people, women, and I'm not going to go into details about who they are and why and when and where and how, but the amount of women, in fact, I probably know more women that have been abused than haven't been abused. It is, and when you see that, when you think about the people who do that, domestic violence almost seems to think, well, of course, that's the next natural progression when they come across people who they can't do that to.
I'm not a big sweary person, Pete. I don't swear a lot. I use it sometimes for colouring in with the things that I say. Yep. But this is one of those particular conversations that riles me so much that I sometimes have difficulty controlling my language. And when we start talking about things like domestic violence and sexual assault, and I look at the men around me and I go, if it's 1 in 4 girls, you're either telling me that it's 1 in 4 men that are doing these crimes, or there's a very small group of men that are doing this over and over and over again. And if that's the case, why the fuck aren't we sorting them out? They should not be free people in society. Like,
do you know one of the problems, Jay? One of the problems is that these people that I know who are the perpetrators, so I've heard it from the women, and I therefore know and can identify the men. None of the families say anything about it. That's why nothing is done about it. I know so many people. I mean, look at, we talked about him earlier on the piece when we started this podcast, Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
Pieces of dirt like him died without having to spend a second in prison because people were too fearful to actually go against him, or they've got to spoil the family or break up the family or whatever because grandpa.
Closer to home, Pete. Rolf Harris.
Oh, mate. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it gets to the point where you just think, okay, I'm in my 60s. Do people look at me and think, oh, that guy looks like a bloody, an old
Yeah.
dirty
And
pervert?
look, Pete, I'm not going to name
Awful.
names, but there's people in the Australian entertainment industry, older men,
Yes.
who rumor has it have been up to these sorts of dirty tricks as well. And it's going to come out in the next few years. No
Yep.
names mentioned, obviously, but these are very, very well-known names.
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty out there, and in time, hopefully, we get to find out about them in the likes of
Justice
Rob
must be
Barris.
served.
Yeah.
I mean, the stats are actually alarming, aren't they?
Oh,
It's effectively, from what I've read, what I've understood, is 1 in 3. So, on average, worldwide, and it's no different in Australia, 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of abuse from a male intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 3. That what that means is every one of us knows someone who has been through it, whether
yeah.
we know they've been through it or not. It could be someone in your family, it could be someone at your church, it could be someone wherever. That's an unbelievable figure. And the fact that it's not that this isn't considered something that when it happens, alarm bells ring and there's repercussions. Often it's just hidden because we forget. We tend to make this kind of a we simplify it a bit and make it as just about that almost caricature of the violent bashing, the once were warriors type imaging. That happens and it's horrific. But we're forgetting there's psychological abuse, there's emotional abuse. Anytime that there is a significant imbalance of power and control in a relationship, sometimes that will extend to violence. But even if it doesn't, that doesn't make it any less abuse.
No.
But often it will coexist. So the fact that there's also emotional and what do you call it, mental manipulation going on as well as the physical is like a barrier of protection for the abuser, because they're taught that what they say doesn't matter, that no one's going to believe them, that their inherent worth is less, and all of this stuff. It's horrific, And for those of you listening who are in the church, as I am, the sad thing is that statistic doesn't change. You would think it would, right? You would think that in congregations of the church, those rates would not apply, but they're exactly the same, which means you look around in your congregations, you're seeing it's happening, and pastors aren't preaching about it. In fact, some of the poor interpretations and the theology around hierarchical leadership and submission and an imbalance of power can contribute to this, let alone poor teachings around divorce and things like that. That should be a form of escape, a form of protection for women, and yet is often cut off from horrific teachings that actually
Do you ever find
aren't.
yourself knowing the stats? Do you ever find yourself in a big group of people, like a party or whatever, and looking around, going, "Okay, statistically,
Yeah.
I have to be looking at a whole bunch of men who are pedophiles or sexual abusers right here in front of me," and you can start looking around. That is an awful situation. Do we have to know about stats? Absolutely, we do, because we need to find out whether you can have an impact or whether we are having an impact. But that kind of power and manipulation just walks hand in hand with domestic violence. It walks hand in hand with the oppression and control of women. And
Pete, I don't want to, for a moment, I don't want to diminish the fact that domestic violence is something against women that we've got to do something about. But I think it's also really important that we acknowledge the fact that some men are victims of domestic violence as well.
True.
And
Absolutely.
I've heard stories of situations where the man has been the victim, the police have turned up, police don't want to believe it, police don't want to accept the fact that the man is the victim. And then what does the man do? How many men's refuges are there? Where can the man go when the man is the one who's being forced out of home? And we need to acknowledge the fact that it is more women that are affected, but that it is an equal opportunity victimhood, and that we need to have processes in place where we're protecting and shielding everyone who is a victim of domestic violence. It's really important that we acknowledge that it can happen to men as well, and not make men feel like they are emasculated or somehow weak and pathetic because they're the ones who are on the receiving end.
Yeah,
100%.
It's not anyone's fault. It's not your fault if you're the one who is the victim of domestic violence. You need to know that there are support structures in place where people will look after you and will help you.
it's
Not to
so
mention, yeah, you go, Roy.
I was gonna say, it's so incredibly difficult to police, for want of another word, but you know what I mean. Because it's not out in the open. You can't see it. The only contact or understanding you might have is you might hear it. It's so difficult to stop something that happens in the confines of your house. It's all done, you can get away with it, and the men do, because they've got their partner living in fear. If you decide to leave or you try, I'm going to get you, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to do whatever, and you will stay here. And how do you stop it? How do you infiltrate the perpetrators and stop this? I don't understand. Interestingly, Greg, and I'd have to perhaps question here, Greg, based upon the latest increase in stats, saying deaths from domestic violence have been falling from 1 in 100,000 in 1990 to 0.3 in 100,000 in 2021. I'll have to check and see if the trend is going down.
0.03.
0.03, yeah. I mean, that's if those stats are true, then yes, maybe the
I don't care if they're true or not. One is too many.
Yeah, sure. But it's nice to know if we're having a win. You
tell that to the woman who gets beaten up tonight. Oh, the numbers are down. Sorry, you got beaten up, but the numbers are down. That's good.
Yeah.
No.
Yep. Government site, he's got them. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Right.
And we're talking, I mean, yeah, that does look like a trend that's improving. Again, doesn't outline the fact that it should be a zero, but also the medical, our medical capacity has increased significantly since 1990. So deaths might not be occurring, but people ending up in the emergency room may not have fallen as drastically. The outcome may be better, but it is good that it's dropping. But it's not good enough until it's zero. And I think when we talk about, even with the men being part of it as well, I think the stats from what I read, and I'd have to verify it, but it's instead of 1 in 3, it's about 1 in 4, although it's typically less violent than in nature. But again, being less violent in nature typically doesn't equate to being less abusive. Abuse can take many forms, and yet the part of that is the shame from society, and the embarrassment of a man saying I was beaten by a woman, and the culture that we live in, and all of that sort of stuff.
Or raped by a woman.
Or raped, absolutely. So that affects disclosure, and it affects seeking help. And we're only now just making strides in that area of mental health and destigmatizing, seeking help for that sort of stuff.
Can I give you a really bad anecdote? When I was at university, I worked as a bouncer, a doorman, and I was at Steve's Hotel in Netherlands. Now, I had dealt with a lot of drunk university students, a lot of entitled young people who felt that they could do whatever they wanted to do. Very often,
you might have knocked me back. I used to go there with a fake ID, and I got they took it off me. It ended a glorious run, so that might have been you.
Well, hey, I knew so little about football in my entire life. I discovered afterwards, I once stopped the Eagles from coming into Steve's, which is apparently their home bar. All I saw was a group of unruly drunk men. And they said, we're going to go. Oh, no, you're not coming in. No, not a chance.
You are a disgrace.
Sorry, I'll carry on my story. So,
wrong team.
Having dealt with so many of these entitled, in the main, young men, seeing this culture of violence that they just felt was perfectly okay to perpetrate, not just on other people, but on us as the security people. But of all of the situations I've ever been in, the only life-threatening situation I've ever been in was by a woman to me. Now, I've been punched, I've been attacked, I've been clawed at, This particular situation, this young woman was going to be thrown out because she had been smashing glasses on the ground. I tried to take her outside. Now, of course, when you're dealing with a female, you've got to be really careful about how you physically deal with it, because there are different cultural norms in place about what you can and can't do. So this particular female was being manhandled to be thrown out of the establishment. The next thing, she grabs a jug of beer, smashes it, and comes swinging at me with a handle of sharded glass. That was the point at which I made a decision that I wasn't going to work as a bouncer anymore. Because although you can deal with that sort of situation, this is a young woman who clearly felt in her inebriated state that it was perfectly okay to put a bloke's life at risk because she wasn't happy with the fact that she was being evicted.
Mm.
What is that woman doing today? Where is she at today? What made her feel so entitled, so aggressive, so irrational that she was prepared to physically threaten someone's life? And how does that reflect the greater society that we've got when you've got these people who are prepared to do that kind of thing? What the hell are we bringing up? What the hell are we teaching people?
Well, I
What
think
are we
because
expecting?
they've always hidden behind the veil, not their general, but people like that have hidden behind the veil of you never punch a woman. So she would do that with that
Impunity.
protection, if you like. Immunity. That's right. I can come to you with whatever, and you're not going to hit me because I'm a woman, and a man can never hit a woman. Meanwhile, that's a whole new another argument, isn't there? The argument is if a woman punches you, can you punch her back? Well, most of society would say no, but the others would ask the question, well, but why not? If she thinks it's okay to punch you, why is it different for me to not punch her back? Do you know what I mean? It's tricky. I mean, I know we would never. I regardless of how many times I was hit by a woman, I would never be able to hit her back. I can't. I just simply could not do that. I could not do that to a woman. The only time I could, if it's an extreme situation where my life was threatened and I had to do that in order to protect myself or my children. Very different if you came across a woman doing something horrible to your children. That's a whole different kettle of fish. You know, that's a whole
I've never hit a woman in my life, even in my job doing bouncing and security. That said, I have dropped a number of them to the floor because that's pretty much the only thing that you can do. If they are particularly aggressive, the only thing you can do is basically take them down and hope to subjugate them that way. It's a horrible, horrible situation to be in. You never want to have to do anything like that.
No,
but
someone like
unfortunately,
you
when
should
you're in
not
that
be a bouncer because you
role-
really have to be an uncaring dick by and large.
And this is the thing,
horrible.
right?
Generalized all bouncers. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that.
I mean, realistically, what we're talking about here is the thread, either in these situations or in abusive situations. The problem is in the violence, whether it's being perpetrated by a male or a female. It's in the violence, and it's what that violence says about how I'm viewing another human being, regardless of their gender. It's that disrespect. There's a difference in worth, and there is a violence for me is a cancer, and we need to. So, for example, we talk about the interesting thing is, if we were in that situation, we'll try to de-escalate the violence with a woman because we don't want to return
even with a man.
the violence with the violence. But yet with a man, often it won't go that far. Do you know what I mean? It'll be the attempt to de-escalate won't go for as long. Not in every case, but often it's because it's acceptable to return that violence in a like manner with the violence. And as I don't know why, but for thousands of years, we keep thinking that that's going to be the answer and the solution, but it doesn't, because they come back next week with their mates. And it's like back in the ancient times, it would be the tribal thing would escalate.
Violence begets violence.
Violence begets violence. You know, and what Gandhi say, you know, if we do the an eye for an eye, the whole world goes blind, and that's absolutely true. The focus needs to be on the violent response, and if we can eliminate that, and again, this is a I understand this is an abstract idea and put into concrete situations, it becomes very, very difficult and challenging, like what we're talking about. But for me, if violence can be eliminated, that's the answer. Yeah,
It is the answer, but the question, Luke, is how much of domestic violence is actually exacerbated by drug use or alcohol?
Of course,
Yeah.
always.
Yeah, of course.
And is that another thing that we should be managing? I mean, look, at its core, you still have to
Absolutely
be
it
the
is.
sort of person that would beat up a woman. But if you also have some grog in your system and you're more likely to do it, should we then be looking at how do we manage the effects that the substances are having on you? And is that the
Absolutely.
government interfering too much in people's lives?
Yeah. Well, addiction is a form of violence against oneself, right? And so how people act in addiction is often drastically different to how they act in sobriety. And it really challenges our understanding of types of people, right? You know, what do we have in us? Because often you got no idea what we have in us until you're in a position like you are unbelievably addicted to opiates, for example, you know, or any drug. It's a very different thing. And like you said, that then becomes, if we're addressing certain things as band-aids when they're symptoms of a far deeper problem, then yes, we do need to address those things, but we also need to look at and say, what is happening here? You know, why are we it's like homelessness. Sure, you can hand out some food, or you can, you know, chuck some blankets, and you can do these things that make you feel like you're doing a difference, but are we addressing the systemic issues that actually drive people to have to live out of their cars, often fleeing from domestic abuse situations?
Yeah, exactly right.
So
Look,
it's, I
for
mean,
me, what it comes down to, and because I know we're approaching the end of the podcast, what it comes down to is this, and it's just 4 words: say something, do something.
yeah, I
If
agree.
you see it happening, if you know it's happening,
Mm.
say something, do something. Don't ignore it, because that person may need your help more than you can possibly realize.
I'd be interested to know the stats on substance abuse connected with domestic violence. I would hazard a guess to think it's probably quite prolific. That you can well imagine that all the stereotyping that we've seen of domestic violence is usually based around the husband being drunk or whatever. But it'd be interesting to know the stats to find out exactly what it is that we're up against without assuming that there's, you know, I don't know. It'd be I'd like to know if there are stats available.
Hmm.
Fenton, oh dude, I did security for California sorority fraternity parties. It was insane. I can only imagine if it's anything like I've seen in movies in the past.
Animal
mate.
House.
Yes, correct. Well done, Fenton. You're a hell of a lot braver than me, but I would imagine you were probably a lot younger and a lot tougher.
We're going to have to get
Now,
Fenton on the show one time. I want to hear more about
Yeah.
this. He's
Right?
got a fascinating life story.
Absolutely. Well, Richard was before. He's gone away on holidays now for a bit, but he was alluding to the fact that we can have people talking on here through the system. That'd be a whole new level. We haven't looked at doing it because we've been just sort of building on what we've done, and we're up to episode 19, and it is growing almost exponentially to a degree with the amount of comments and the amount of hits. I think there's 675 views now, and YouTube are pretty impressed by the amount of people that we do have either watching live or watching replays. So make no mistake, people listening, we appreciate you doing this more than you can imagine, because if no one's listening or watching, then obviously it's pointless. I do want to wrap up, Luke, asking you a question, and this is a serious question, and I want you to think carefully about the answer, which I know you will. And it's kind of a 2-part question. And I want to ask you, do you feel the need to excuse religion for what is happening in modern day based upon the way men dominated the writings back in the day? Do you feel responsible for excusing them or having a reason why? And do you think that the world right now in 2024 would be a better place if religion never existed? Let's just say it never was a thing, never existed. Do you think we'd be exactly the same kind of people we are now? In other words, do you think that the Bible had impact on the continuation of male dominance, allowing for the fact that it was only men who wrote the Bible? For whatever reason, women weren't educated enough to partake. So there's a whole 50% of the population, those nurturing, caring, beautiful people were taken out, and the men were left in a way, although they didn't realize it at the time, of course, to set the standard of men and women through time to here we are today, talking about how in so many ways we haven't moved a millimeter forward. Do you accept responsibility of the church for doing that? And what would you think it would be like now if no such thing existed?
No, I don't feel I need to excuse the Bible. Well, I guess to answer the question around religion, no, I don't think the world would be a better place without it. That doesn't mean it's been perfect. We could spend all night, and I'm the very first person to criticize many of the aspects of religion, being man's attempt to codify and understand God and portray God's wishes in the world. The Crusades, obviously, we're talking about patriarchy and things like that. All of those things have been perpetuated through religion, or through certain elements of that. But that doesn't outdo. Yeah, you can't. For me, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's always been streams and elements of faith that have bucked against that. Hospitals were invented by Christians. The Christians that devote their entire lives to the poor and the marginalized are actually in the manner that Jesus teaches. You can't lump them in with the same thing, because clearly they're acting in a different way. They have a different perception, a different understanding. They're reading often the same text, but they're getting something very, very different from it. The Bible was used to condone and justify slavery for many, many years, but it was also used by the abolitionists, who were Christians, to drive the abolition of slavery. So it's and when it comes to the actual text, the actual Bible, I'm not making excuses for it by saying it was written by men because it was a patriarchal culture. I'm just giving the Bible the respect of allowing it to be a document from the time that it was written, which is not the same thing that many of us do now, by treating it as this eternal thing that needs to be viewed the same way that we would now. So we can't view history the same way that we would view a history book that was written today, because it was a different kind of thing. We can't, we just can't treat it with the same lens that we have for what we find acceptable today in many areas, because these are documents written at the time. They didn't think it was scripture. Paul didn't think he was writing the Bible. The Gospels didn't. The writers of the Gospels didn't think that these were letters. These were things that were for a particular audience at a particular point in time. Do they
Then
have?
why isn't it not just shelved then? Why isn't it going, okay, I listen to what you're saying. I agree entirely. It isn't something that translates to 2024 for any purpose whatsoever. Why don't they just put it in the shelf and then find another way to worship God, Jesus, without a book that you, by your own admission, is just not something that necessarily should be referred to or fits into modern culture? I don't understand that if it's that old, which
No,
it is.
I didn't say. I didn't. I think it's still valuable. Clearly, I think it's still valuable. I love the Bible.
But it's
I think
either
it's
all
still
valuable or it's all not valuable. It can't be bits and pieces. Of
Nah,
good
that's
and the rest
rubbish.
of it's rubbish.
No, because that's not applied to any other document in the world, right? Literally no other document would you say this is either all valuable or not. You read a book and you go, I agree with bits, but if you come across something and you go, I don't think the author's quite got it right there, you don't say the whole book is rubbish. granted, not every book is given the status, the elevated status that the Bible is given. I hear you there. But what I'm also saying is, I think when we treat the Bible the way that it actually is expected to be treated, not by putting expectations on it that we have no right to put on it.
But
For
its
example,
claims are astronomical, Luke. It claims more than any book or any culture, any religion, anything in the history of man. It claims the ultimate of everything. It's got to be held accountable, mate.
the Bible's not claiming anything. The
No,
Bible
not,
isn't
no,
claiming.
not in itself, but because everyone has made it into what it is, that's why it is the most popular, the most read document in the
Does
history
the
of
Bible not
mankind.
say in itself, does the Bible not actually say this is the word of God?
No, the Bible's not the word of God. Jesus is the word of God. And this is the
Jesus
problem
didn't
that we
write the
have.
Bible, so that makes no sense.
No, well, that's right, because it's text. It's not the word of God. God didn't write it. Jesus didn't
No.
write it.
So
But
this
that
is where
doesn't
I
mean
get
it's not
confused,
valuable.
because I hear what you're saying, Luke, and I actually believe you more than I believe the other Christians in my life who tell me that the Bible is the infallible word of God, word for
No,
word, the literal word of God.
yeah,
You need to
and
get used to it.
that's
No, I know.
the whole infallibility of the Bible. That idea has only been around for about 40 to 50 years, right? That's a fairly new and young doctrine or idea. Certainly not part of the ancient faith. The Bible never claims to be infallible or inerrant. The But in saying all of this, right, it's easy to pick and go, there are all these horrible things, but you also I see when I read through it, these incredibly beautiful and progressive pictures, right, of God by fallible men, right, who are writing this, who didn't get it all right. But for me, it glimpses something about God. Is it the whole picture? No. That's why you can't just treat the Bible as the only method for God. You could never pick up the Bible in your life, ever, not read a single word of it, and you could have a rich relationship with God, right? Because not everything in the Bible is containing God. Right? Not everything in the Bible actually is reflective of what God thinks or what God does. There is all sorts there. God is not bound to operate through this book or this collection of books in any capacity. It's easy for us because we want to control God, right? The idea of a God that transcends everything, a God that actually, can be experienced outside of our churches or outside of being a card-carrying member of our congregation, we don't like that. So it's easy to kind of say, well, actually, the only way is by saying this particular prayer, attending this particular church and this particular denomination, and viewing the Bible in this particular way. But it's
Pete
not
actually
true.
brought up a word which I feel has a lot of emotional baggage attached to it, and it's a question. I know it's kind of off topic from tonight's podcast, but it's a question I'd like to ask you. Why, or at least what is the point of worship? Your relationship with God shouldn't be about prostrating yourself to the higher entity. I mean, the whole concept of worship to me seems a little idolatry. It's kind of like,
Worship
I don't
often ends up
understand
being
why it
idolatry.
exists. Like, what is worship about?
Worship
Why
is
is it even there?
it's a really old word, right? It's a very, very old word that has carried through. But the meaning behind it needs to be, I think if we understood that, then we would understood it better. For example, if worship is literally just gathering around, singing songs, crying and putting our hands up, which I'm not against. I love that. I've experienced God in those spaces. I think that's great. But if we relegate worship to just that, we've missed the point, right? Because that's just an updated modern version of sacrificing turtle doves, or being unclean and needing to present yourself to the temple, with a certain type of payment in order to then be made clean again. It's a idea of working towards God's acceptance. for me, Jesus comes, undoes all of that completely. And I believe the best way to worship God is to actually kind of listen to what Jesus was talking about and act and live in that way.
Is God asking
love your
to be
neighbor.
worshipped?
That's worship.
Is
No,
God
but we're
asking to be
inherent.
worshipped? Is Jesus asking to be worshipped?
No, Jesus never asked to be worshipped. This is the thing. But there's nothing inherently wrong with worship, right? Worship, I think, is that part of us who recognizes that there is something beyond ourselves and is almost like, what do I do with this? You know,
So it's deference and respect.
deference and respect. Now, as a child, when you don't understand that, you know, you're very timid with your parents in a way sometimes, and that can be abused and all sorts of stuff because you're just like, this person's not, they're responsible for me and I don't quite know. In a healthy household, a love enables a freedom for them to truly flourish and be who they are, the children.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for me, I don't want my child to worship me, but I want the best thing for them. I want them to listen
Yes.
to me because I
Yeah.
love them and I want the best for them. And I don't want to control them, but I want to guide them to, you know, so if they were to do that, if you want to label that worship, whatever. But again, God is not a God who demands our worship. There's a lot of fundamentalists that will say that. There's a lot of conservative Christians that will say that.
Does
There's
he
a lot
not
of
in
stuff in the Bible
does-
that will say that.
Does he not, Luke, in the sense that the definition of worship is the expression of reverence and adoration for a deity? So it's not actually applicable to any other person who isn't a deity, which includes God. So by
Well, that's
Thou
right,
shalt
yeah.
not place any other idols before me.
Of course, worship. I
Yeah.
mean, and that's where my example is limited because I'm not God. But the father-child
now you
dynamic,
tell it.
it
What?
is only in relation to a deity. But I think, in terms of deference and respect, the best way to do that is actually by living out God's understanding of justice, right? To be to be the hands and feet of Jesus per se. For me, you can sing all the songs you want, but if you walk past your neighbor or you got the blinders on to anything that's happening around outside of your little bubble, how much is that worship? How is that showing respect to God, who literally models to seek out injustice, you know, to defend the oppressed, to be there for the
Yep.
poor, the
So you're saying
marginalized?
don't just talk the talk, walk the walk.
That is worship for me, you know. And lastly, because I know we've got to finish up, but I do want to say it doesn't matter what we see Paul. I mean, I can pick apart all the writings about Paul and explain how it's misunderstood and all that sort of stuff. And there is very much an argument there. But if we want to look at what the Bible's take on women is, even back to Adam and Eve, right, and the creation story, which is a story, it's a myth, but there's truth in it that we can learn from, right? It doesn't have to be a
Bloody
historical
Eve,
event.
Eve,
You know,
your fault.
they are created equal. You know, like Eve is taken from the rib. The rib's on the side. You know, that they are equal always. And anything that is comes around submission comes after the fall, right? Which is like this idea of, in a broken world, the patriarchy exists. It's not God's design in any capacity. And you look when Jesus comes and he bucks every single societal norm. He has friends that are women. He's constantly intervening and upholding women and elevating women, bringing them honor and respect, and challenging all of these norms around that society, around the role of women. You know, in every single thing, it's all through it, which obviously we don't have time for me to go into, but safe to say, if you looked at just the Gospels, women play a far, far bigger role and are painted in a far better light than any of the men in the New Testament. But even in Paul's writings, he's writing to women. He's got women that are still disciples, that are elders, that are deacons in the church. You know, so this same guy who the church is taking a certain line in things saying, oh, women can't be in leadership, he's all throughout his writings talking about women that he's doing leadership with and that are preaching and that are doing this. So we can't ignore those and then just pick this. You know,
I'm clearly very Jesus-like because I like women a lot as well.
Mate, you are very Jesus like that's incredible.
Luke, do you not, Luke? Just going back to my original opening for tonight, and just on what you said about Adam and Eve, and do you not find in any way, shape, or form the sexism in that writing that the first person that God made just happened to be a man, and when he needed someone, he didn't create Eve the way he created Adam. He chose to make
Eve is a
Eve out of
derivative.
the rib of Adam, meaning that without, and this is the origins, of course, of the original opening statement, which was, and I'll just reiterate, one of the greatest lies of patriarchy is framing the father as the life giver. That to me, that is classic. I don't know how you can see it any other
It's also
way.
not true, is it? Women are the life givers.
Correct, and yet
Absolutely. Well, I mean, but even in the story of Adam and Eve, right? The fact that at that time, we're talking the Genesis story probably was, yeah, it's debated, but we're talking maybe 3,500 years ago.
I'll go
And
for 5.
well, probably, I mean, it's probably earlier than, later than what we've thought. It's certainly not the first
It
book of the
doesn't
Bible.
matter. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, either way, we're talking about that time.
Yep.
And then we have this myth, this story that comes about that says that both men and women, right, are created in the image of God. Not man was created in the image of God and woman was then created in the image of man. It explicitly talks about man and woman created in the image of God. It also explicitly talks about the difference between man and woman, which we know, right? Scientifically, there's different organs, there's different sexuality. And yet both are the image of God, which means man alone cannot be fully the image of God. Woman alone cannot be fully the image of God.
And that God is a hermaphrodite.
Right? God, if you want to label it that, God is that, right? God, and so yes, the Bible might often use masculine language around God, but not always, right? I mean, we've got here's a couple of examples talking about God as mother. It's in all throughout the Old Testament, God is like a woman in labor. In Isaiah, God's referred to as a mother suckling her children, a mother who does not forget the child she nurses, a mother who comforts her children, a mother who births and protects Israel, a mother who gave birth to the Israelites, a mother who calls, teaches, holds, heals, feeds her young. You know, it often, even the Bible will talk about God being a seamstress who makes clothes for Israel, a midwife attending to a birth, a woman working
more about things that they do rather than who they are.
Well, those things were common female roles at the time, right? So, but even
itself,
when Jesus uses an analogy of what God is like, he uses the picture of a mother hen who wants to gather her chicks, right? That's the imagery that Jesus calls on. So, yeah, it's often the whole father language. That is a very common thing, but in no way is the Bible saying that, or should we even rationally understand God to be male or even to be predominantly male? In no way. Like God is just as much female. You could theologically call God mother equally as accurate as you could.
Can I leave you with another thought as well? And perhaps this is another topic for another night. I wonder if sexism and the cultural differences between men and women are actually primarily a Christian innovation, because when I look at other cultures that predate Christianity, for example, the Egyptian dynasties, you had leaders of Egypt that were women, Nefertiti and Cleopatra. You know, these are females that were respected and were deferred to. Well, Elizabeth Taylor as a good example of an Egyptian, a famous Egyptian woman. But you know what I'm saying? You know, there are other cultures historically that had women at the top echelons of society. Now, I'm not sure that it's an innately human condition to actually subjugate women. I see that as being more of a Christian/Western temperament.
But in saying that, though, that patriarchy existed well and truly before before the Hebrew Bible even came along. So right back, yes, clearly there were elements, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't an inherent imbalance. I agree at the very start with the hunter and gatherer stuff. There might have been different roles, but I don't think there was an imbalance I don't think patriarchy existed in that aspect. I think it certainly developed later. But I think the Hebrew Bible and then the New Testament, the Christian, I guess, offshoot of that, was really born into a world that was already in that space to a degree. Did it perpetuate that? I think later on, but I think earlier on, it bucked against it. It certainly did. Particularly in the New Testament, the early church, that what we understand is there was no differential. In fact, it was quite radical because of that. You had men and women, you had slaves and their masters. There was and Jews and Gentiles all coming together. This melting pot of people that should not have been mixing in that hierarchical sense, but were bucking that.
Why were none of the 12 disciples women?
I can only imagine because it was only the 12 men that were written about. But I think he did have
historically women weren't. Women are almost seen but not heard back then, I would imagine. I mean,
yeah.
There was no leadership roles. There was no reading.
Someone's got to make the sandwiches.
But then you look at the Gospels, and all the men desert him, and it's the women who don't desert him. It's women who were the very first to find this body and to the first people to preach it. It's a woman at the well who's the very first person that Jesus tells that he is the Messiah. It's the woman who's being stoned by all the men, or about to be stoned by the men, who Jesus intervenes at.
No one's trying to take women out of the Bible at all, Luke, but I think that you're clutching at straws using stories about women, which there are hundreds of mentions of women in the Bible. But I think it's going away from the original discussion. We were trying to connect to 2024 to the obvious misogynistic, patriarchal, women may or may not have been downtrodden, but we're trying to connect the connection, or the reality of the now from then, and trying to see the perpetuation of that patriarchal society. And I just, when you were talking, we said hunters and gatherers, and I thought hunters and gatherers was not something that would have been discussed. It was a natural progression out of what people were good at, the same as what Jason was talking about from the beginning about him and his wife, and the natural progression about what people do, because that's where the hunters and collectors, because men were bigger and stronger and they weren't afraid of animals or whatever, but the women had to be somewhere else because they were the mothers and looking after the children. So it was a natural thing. And I just
of course, but even
go on.
But the stories I'm saying, just to respond to that just quickly, what I'm not doing is mentioning a bunch of incidental. This woman's mentioned and this woman's mentioned, so therefore the Bible is pro women. The stories that I'm mentioning are significant. They are in each of those circumstances. The content, right, and everything in there is for a reason. So it's very easy to remove these stories. It'd be very easy to alter and to edit and to change these stories, right? That all the men disappeared.
The rest of the Bible, you mean?
Well, what I'm saying is the fact that these are the fact that this is the picture that we're getting, right, of how Jesus interacts with women, how he elevates women, empowers them, respects them, and how he treats them. It's important that was kept in. At this point, it actually says a huge statement, and these aren't incidental mentioning this woman's mentioned. These are significant, and they attest to the character of Jesus, and they attest to the character of what Jesus would expect from his followers. The fact that has changed and that has been distorted isn't a reflection of God or Jesus, is more of a reflection of people who have misinterpreted for their own gain and benefit or have chosen to interpret things in a way that they gain or benefit. I
have no gain or benefit for what I'm bringing up as far as that goes. I want women.
You don't, but preachers do sometimes. right?
Yes, I know, but
So,
I think exactly what you're doing is highlighting what women did and ignoring the fact that they weren't respected or seen as being equal to men, that it was a completely domineering men writing for men. They weren't writing for anyone else. They were writing for men. They didn't consider women to be worthy. They weren't educated. They weren't allowed to write and participate. It is a complete and utter landslide for men. And I can't believe you're trying to defend God by suggesting that he sees women as being so important and equal, yet the whole writings of the Bible completely contradict everything you've said, Luke. I'm sorry, but it's
God didn't write it.
clearly.
God didn't
Hey?
write the Bible.
No, we're
God
not
didn't
talking about
write it.
I'm not talking about who wrote it. We know who wrote it. We know that God didn't write the Bible. Forget about let's just take God out of the equation completely, because we're talking about the Bible. The Bible was written. You are quoting it. You are referring to whoever wrote it for whatever reason. All of the things in there. There are stories about women. Yes, absolutely. But you're connecting what's written in the Bible to God by saying God sees men and women as being equal. The Bible would contradict that to the nth degree, that there is no equality between men and women. You must see that. And you can't just then say, well, hang on a minute, God didn't write it, therefore he's out of it here. But hang on a minute, he says that all men and women are equal. And then you go through and highlight all the things that women have done, getting God off the hook again, when clearly the Bible is a misogynistic, male-dominated bunch of stories about men, not about, well, some of them are about women, but
the
women have
fact
no
that the
say in
Bible
what
was
they wanted to
written,
be written about. Women weren't asked, what would you like to be in the Bible? They're just men have written and chosen what to write about them.
yes, absolutely. And that's where the very first thing I started was saying it was written in a misogynistic, patriarchal culture. That's without question, right? And that's reflective in a lot of the writings. But the very fact it was written in that culture makes that some of these stories about women stand out and makes the progressive stance in a lot of the areas, not just in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well, about women. It makes it stand out. Now, is it the final story? Is that where the story ends? Absolutely not. Right? Does the Bible accurately and fully capture the equality of men and women? No. But are there shades of it in there? Are there elements of it in there? Absolutely. It's not an open and shut thing that says the Bible is just purely misogynistic, even though there are elements of it that are because of the culture it was written in. But there are also significant, like we've got Paul saying, there is no difference between men and women. Hugely, hugely radical and progressive for the time that was written, right? Makes sense, but at the time, hugely. A lot of the Levitical laws, even thousands of years prior to the New Testament, are designed to protect women and stood in stark contrast to the cultures around them, the other Mesopotamian cultures around them and their codes of law and things like that. These were incredibly progressive. Even when Jesus talks about divorce and marriage, it's done in a context for protecting a woman, right, in a culture that they needed protection, right, because they were treated as property. Now, is that the end of the story? Absolutely not, right? We now know better. But at the time, when we read it in light of this and we realize, okay, so this was done in order to protect women, this is the position that they're taking, then we have to understand that. We have to then reflect that instead of just saying, well, the whole thing is just ridiculous because no women wrote it. Well, yeah, no women wrote in it, and that's a shame. But that's reflective of the time of what it was written. That doesn't make
why
God,
is that a ridiculous thing to say? If it's actually a truth and an accurate truth, why does that make it ridiculous?
No, it's not ridiculous to say that. It's ridiculous to say that is what God intended. That's God's
We don't
position
know.
on things.
We need to keep God out of this because neither you and I know anything about what God actually thinks or says or does.
No, but for me as a Christian, right? And I can only go from that. What I look at is what does Jesus do and how does Jesus act? Right?
Yep, I can relate to that. Yep. Well, we have his writings, so we and what he said, we have that, but we don't have any intel on God. No one does.
But fair enough. But all I can go on is that. And the way I see Jesus treat and interact with women stands in stark contrast to the time that he was there in the first century.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So I use that as my hermeneutic to operate out. And then I see all of the progressive stances on women and on equality throughout the Bible, right? That doesn't take away the negative stuff, right? I get that. But you need to choose one of them, right? Or you could throw it in the bin, and that's a valid option, which, you said you just throw the whole thing in the bin. Fair enough. I don't begrudge
I
you
didn't
for
say
it.
the
But as
bin.
a
I did
Christian-
put it in a nice bookshelf.
Gentlemen,
Fair
I
enough.
hate to be a party pooper, but I'm going to have to fly. I award you both the participation trophy this evening for doing very, very well indeed. But I have to do other things. My dinner is getting cold.
Your
Basically,
dinner, yes, it's 10:15. We have
Yeah, we probably
this is
do
the
need to
first
wind it up.
we've ever gone this long. So let's wrap
I'll-
it up then.
Shall I do the clip, the outro,
What's the outro?
the little video? We'll just say our
Oh yeah,
goodbyes with the video.
I've got to say goodbye and thank everyone, stuff like that. But
Yeah,
yes,
cool.
thank you everyone, Fenton, Greg, and who was the other one? Frank. Thanks for participating. Great to have your involvement. We'll do it again next Wednesday. We know not what the subject matter will be, but it will be something, no doubt, that will cause division, deriding, any other word you think of that starts with D. But thanks so much. Thanks, Jace. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, me. We'll do it
well
again.
done, Rowie.
Thanks.
Good job.
It's so, just before I go, the last thing I'd like to say, it's so funny arguing with someone about a book that I don't believe in. I
I can
find,
assure you, Peter. I can assure you, it exists. It does exist.
yes, it's true. I've read it many times. I just think I get to the end and I think, why am I doing this? I don't even believe in this book. Why am I arguing against a book that I don't believe in or a God that doesn't exist? It's enthralling, but it's kind of doesn't achieve an awful lot. But anyway, thanks, guys. An atheist, a believer, and a pastor walk into a bar continues next Wednesday. Rich still won't be back, but we might have Suresh. So thanks again, guys. Appreciate it. Au revoir.
See you.